you that I said that I wanted to talk about teaching discrimination and labor markets today. And I'm going to start by telling you I don't have all the answers for sure. So I want us to be able to have a conversation. And what I want to do is raise some issues for us to be thinking about in that conversation. So let's take stock of inclusivity in economics. And I've been talking about inclusivity in economics for a really long time. So I was like, well, surely we fixed it by now, right? And then I looked at the data and like the pandemic just made us stop thinking about it for a little while. And in fact, that meant that we've actually stopped making a lot of progress, unfortunately. So what's our story? Our student body is increasingly diverse. And I want to actually go through some of those numbers. I don't know about you guys. I knew that enrollment is down in two-year colleges, but I didn't know what that was doing in terms of the racial mix. So I want to show you just a little bit of data on that. And here's a fact. Economics is falling behind other fields in terms of diversity. So, we're sort of treading water relative to our past, but that means sinking relative to everybody else. I think I would put this all together to say, in a lot of ways, economists are failing to win hearts and minds. And we can think about that narrowly in like our principal's classroom. Are we convincing students? And there, we can look at, I think some of the most jarring data I've seen is that students can answer our questions correctly on the exam about policy issues and absolutely not bend one tiny bit on their views on the policy issues, even if they tell us what we want to know about housing policy or minimum wage policy. So we can think about it that way. We can also think about it sort of more broadly in the sort of public world that, economists are not known to, frankly, be like trusted guardians of, that people should listen to. And I think that's particularly problematic right now in a period of high inflation and in a period in which I think good economic policy probably matters more than ever. So what can we do? I want to talk about reaching more students. And one thing here is acknowledging market failure early and often, embracing economic models of discrimination. I'm an empiricist, so it's just kind of a big thing for me to say. I think you want to start with the models. And when I get to this, I'm going to talk about how we changed our textbook to embrace the models first and to understand the limits of empirical evidence and the way students might hear the way we present empirical evidence on discrimination. And I want to point out how important it is to move beyond individual behavior and for me to get a better glasses prescription because I could have sworn that said move. So let's start with the recent declines in enrollment. So this is 2010 and 2020. This is very recent data from the National Center on Education Statistics. Unfortunately, they're slow to compile this stuff and get it out. So I know all of us would rather see like what happened in the 2021, 2022 year, or even right now, but this is 2020. And what I thought was interesting is compared to 2010, so Hispanic enrollment, the trend up was strong enough that any decline between 2019 and 2020 did not undo the upward trend. We see basically similar declines in that 10-year period among white and among black. We see no movement in Asian. And again, I think that mostly what you want to be thinking about is the fact that because this is a 10-year span, when you don't see any decline, it's because whatever the trend was between 2010 and 2019 is bigger than the drop-off to 2020. So it seems like the recent declines in enrollment impacted many students across the board, although as I think all of us know, this impacted two-year schools much more than four-year schools, and it's impacted less competitive schools much more than more competitive schools. If you want to see the immediate change between 2019 and 2020, this is the immediate college enrollment rate of high school completers. So how many seniors went on to college? And we're not surprised that a bunch of people graduating in 2020, we're like, I'm not starting school this fall. So, we can only take so much stock in this, but I think what's interesting is to see the relative changes. So, you see a drop off of people going to 2-year institutions the drop was twice as big as 4-year institutions. So that's a fact that we all knew. A drop among whites, among blacks, among Hispanics, but an increase among Asians. And again, part of the problem is on these races, notice they do a moving average. So I'm not sure if that's part of what's going on. I think they're trying to smooth the noise in the data. What we clearly see is like this, there was sort of across the board hit in terms of who went to school, but nothing that's undoing the march towards a much, much, much more diverse classroom. So, although I guess at some point you might say, well, maybe we're actually moving towards a less diverse classroom because the march towards it being female has continued. And the women have been more than half, and they're continuing to uptake a larger share. And, so that's moving towards being a more monolithic number. In 2020, there were 156 female graduate students for every 100 male graduate students. I can tell you in 2015, I presented a similar fact. So in 2015, it was 135 female for every 100. So that's the movement, 135 to 156. This enrollment in graduate school is soaring for women. If we look at that, going straight to college at either a 2 or a 4-year school, it's 2/3 of girls right now. That's actually a decline. So that's that 2020 number from it being about 73-74% before. Men had an even bigger decline than women did between 2019 and 2020. So men are now 59% of men who finished high school go on to college, and compared to 67% of girls. So what is this doing? These are patterns that have been going on for a long time, and they're changing the labor market. And we're actually feeling some of those changes in the labor market in terms of where people work and what they do. And here you can see educational attainment among 25 to 34-year-olds. So now we're just like, let's just look at our young population. What do they look like? Well, among Hispanic 25 to 34-year-olds, in a 10-year period, you've more than doubled the share that have a college degree, not a bachelor's degree. And you've more than doubled the share that have a master's degree. So this is really changing how the labor market looks, because and you can see here, again, that gender gap is there among the Latino population as well, with a lot more women. Nearly 30% of Latinas 25 to 34 years old have a bachelor's degree now. What about Black non-Hispanic 25 to 34-year-olds? Again, we see that gender gap. Again, we see that upward increase. Again, we're seeing a number that, over the last, say, 20-ish years has pretty much doubled, both when you're looking at BAs and when you're looking at the master's degrees. So now if we're looking at 25 to 34-year-old African-American women, roughly a third have a bachelor's degree and 10% have a master's. If we're looking at the men, it's roughly a quarter have a bachelor's degree, and about 6 or 7% have a master's. So that's how our world is looking. That's how our classroom is looking. What's going on in economics in terms of other fields? The sciences are attracting more women to their ranks. So this slide, the numbers down there are by birth year of the student. And what you can see is biology has soared. Math has soared. I've been talking about women in economics for a long time, and people would say, oh, it's the math. It's not the math, because women are doing well in math. So that can rule out that it's the math. So what is, let's take a look at economics. This is from the latest CSWEP report. And what you can see is there has been an increase in new PhDs who are women. It's taken a long time to get that number to, I said new PhDs, full professors. It took a long time for that to tick up, but that started ticking up around 2007. These numbers are so small that I think when I became a full professor, I might have helped tick the number up, right? We can see we've made progress there. But I think the real place that we're trying to look at is, making progress among the student body, and we're not making a ton of progress there. So the seniors is that pink line, and you can see that pink line has been at least sort of flat since 2014, and I don't know if that sort of 2009, 2008 number is an outlier or not, but not a lot of change. Somewhere between 30 and 35% of our undergraduate majors are women. Well, I just told you 65% of the students are women. So when 35% of the majors are women, you're far off where you need to be. Parity in your major, because you're not controlling admissions to the school, parity in your major would be 65% women, and we're at around 35%. What about minorities? Here you can see from the latest SEMGAP report, econ is going down at a time when all subjects is rising. And we can see a little bit of a tick down in STEM, but STEM well exceeds economics. So again, this isn't a math or science issue, right? Economics is just failing to reach some of our important students. We're just not attracting them. And here, I hesitated because I'm an empirical person. Many of you are empirical, and you're going to show me about a population that's half a percentage point. But I think it's actually important, right? So this is the historic Native American population, and I don't really understand what's going on with the NCES that they still call it the American Indian, because I think my children would actually make me write an essay on inclusivity if I didn't use what they call the language that they told me to use. But you can see that there's not been a decline in the population, but there has been a decline in majors in all subjects, but it's been worse in economics than any other major. So, really excluding our indigenous population. Other fields have taken action. And I think some of the best advice comes from the UK's Institute of Physics as guidelines for instructors that I think all economics should embrace wholeheartedly. We should use everyday language instead of jargon. That's really important, because when you use everyday language, it feels familiar and you've removed a stumbling block. Jargon is really, really exclusionary. People have to ask what that means. And it excludes in so many ways. And sometimes we feel like something's not jargon because we're so used to using it, but it is. And we have to really step outside ourselves and think, is this a word that other people know? Does it feel familiar? When I teach elasticity, one of the things I love most about elasticity is that it's the ordinary use of the words. So when I say something's elastic, I show them a picture of Slinky Dog, from Toy Story. And I'm like, hey, look, it's elastic. It moves. That's what we're talking about. But some of our words are not. And it's important when we can to connect them to sort of the everyday uses. Call on students at random instead of asking for volunteers. Use examples that relate to students' everyday experiences. Remember, all knowledge is built on the scaffolding of existing knowledge. Everything new we learn is shaped, created, and taken in through all of our existing knowledge and past experiences. And so, I talk a lot about examples, and I sometimes feel when I'm having those conversations that people think examples are like the decorations on the cake. It makes it look pretty. But it's not the decorations on the cake. It's actually what allows students to connect. We know that people walk away from stories, from things that they can resonate with. They look for connections. And so using examples that relate to their everyday experiences, and that means everybody's everyday experiences. I was telling some people last night, I had a student last year from Bolivia, and he got to the point in the textbook where we talk about the market for quinoa and how quinoa had such an increase in demand around the world that a lot of people used to feed their chickens with it, and now they no longer feed their chickens with it. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, I've never in my entire college experience felt like anybody really saw my family's background before I got to this example. And I could hear my grandfather saying, I don't get why these people eat quinoa. It's chicken food. He's like, that is like my family story. And so he might not have related to very many other examples in the book. I don't know. But that one spoke to him so much that it really connected him to the material. And that's what we're looking for, is for every student to just have a few things that they feel like, these people really get me. Avoid male and female stereotypes and examples. Emphasize that sexist language is unacceptable. Keep track of the number of male and female students you're interacting with during class. So those are some ideas. Let's talk a little bit more about what we can do now in economics. So principles is many students' first introduction to economics. And if your principles courses aren't inclusive, it becomes difficult for the field to be more diverse. If you think about, we look through the whole pipeline. And one of the things I've really struggled with this is you look through the pipeline and they say, well, we don't have a lot of female full professors because we don't have a lot of associates because we don't have a lot of assistants. I think at every level that we need to take action. I was once giving a talk at the central bank in Australia, and they said, there's nothing we can do, it's a pipeline problem. And I'm like, look, if everybody says, there's nothing I can do, it's the person behind me, the next thing we know, there's some poor kindergarten teacher standing there holding the weight of the world on her shoulders because she put butterflies in the girls' bathroom and, planets in the boys' bathroom. So we have to take action at every level, but I do think that there is a particular burden of principles to make every student feel included, because students don't go on, find it hard to go on to something else if they didn't feel like this worked for them. So how do we make it more interesting? More real-world examples related to well-known companies or just aspects of their lives. We want to make economics useful to their lives, explore a wider range of industries, including services. One of the things that's really interesting to me is, 15% of our labor market works in the goods producing sector, 85% in the service sector, and you pick up a lot of economics books and you'd think it was the opposite. That 85% of the examples are in the goods producing sector, 15% in the services. And our students, if they've had experience working, if they know about their parents' jobs, the jobs aren't in the goods producing sector because most people don't work there. I think that we tend to, I think that it's really important that we emphasize concepts because students are going to relate to concepts more. Math is really easy to test, but it's also easy to forget. Now, I've had so many students tell me that have come to me as public policy students who've taken econ before. I remember the elasticity formula, and I got an A on all of that, but I can't remember what it's for or why you would want to know that. And I felt sad about that. I'd rather them forget the formula, because you can look that up and remember why do we care about elasticity? Elasticity is incredibly important for thinking about how you should view public policy as well as obviously markets. So what can we do to reach more students? So one is acknowledging market failure early and often. So markets are amazing, but they fail all the time. And we know that, but sometimes I think we get so caught up in the idea of perfect competition that we treat everything else as a tiny exception. And that just feels false to students. Not only it feels false because it is false, but also it puts us in a mindset where we start by assuming the world. Our null hypothesis is everything is perfectly competitive. So then we're looking for evidence that it's not. And that's probably not how we should use perfect competition. So when I teach perfect competition, I say, market failure is all around us. How would I even know how big of a problem that is if I don't know what the alternative would be? So if I want to benchmark how bad this problem is that you have identified, well, I need to know what the world would look like if we didn't have the problem. And so that's how I can, it's from the very beginning of teaching, talk about perfect competition as being crucial. It's important for you to learn this, not because it's easy, not because we want to make a bunch of assumptions, but because this is going to give me a way to think about, okay, if I was able to get to the best outcome possible, like, what would it look like? Okay, so perfect competition is going to tell me this thing about efficiency. And, how would we maximize that? But I think it's really important that students hear repeatedly that markets don't work perfectly so that they can believe in market forces. Because that's one of the things where I say we're failing to, win hearts and minds. So many students today have lumped together the idea of big business and capitalism is getting the little guy down and is bad with markets. I'm like, no. Markets are the thing that are gonna defeat like corporate interests. Businesses are out there lobbying government to reduce market forces, not increase them. They want to reduce them in order to have more power. So when you have students, regardless of where they are politically, to help them understand that market competition has the effect of keeping prices down for consumers. It has the magic of allocating goods to where they're going to be produced most efficiently. It has the magic of allocating goods to the people who value them the most. So we can talk about the importance of efficiency, but it's also important that we teach them that efficiency is a normative criterion. So when I teach, I want my students to understand the difference between positive economics, sort of a description, right, of what is factual, and normative economics, which is laden with values. Efficiency is a normative criteria. Efficiency is not the only thing that matters. I love efficiency as much as any other economist, and I really hate bureaucratic inefficiency. But I have to admit that there are other things that matter. So economists, we often get so caught up in teaching this efficiency model, all policy judgments must, rely on value judgments. So, it's often implicit, but there's always value judgments. So when we think about economic surplus, we talk about the benefits of a decision, less the cost. We count all the benefits and costs, no matter who they accrue to. Economic efficiency, the more surplus that's generated, the better the outcome. And then we get these efficient outcomes, the outcome that yields the largest possible economic surplus. That sounds really neutral, but it implicitly embeds a lot of value judgments, right? And economists have often stopped here and been like, oh, the distributional stuff is for somebody else. I think as a profession, we've moved on to trying to think about things like, Esther DeFlo's economist as the plumber. You actually have to think about the processes and how you get things done. But we have to make, we want to think about the criteria is not just efficiency, there's also equity. An outcome yields a greater equity if it results in a fair distribution. Well, obviously that raises its own set of questions, but just because it's raising questions doesn't mean we shouldn't be letting students know that equity and efficiency, yes, they can be in conflict. That's what every economics book teaches, but they're not necessarily in conflict, and they don't have to be. So we don't have to say So there's always an equity efficiency trade-off because they're not. But there's a third point that you really need to recognize, which is that these are consequentialist criteria that ignore processes. And people care a lot about processes. They care a lot about fairness. And, there's a psychologist at the University of Michigan who studies how children view distribution and how it changes as they get older. So we're actually all born valuing fairness, like at pretty high levels, right? We've all heard like the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old have an argument about what's fair. But, it's sort of, we then this is where economists get critiqued, is like we join the market economy and then we're like, all's fair, whoever's got the money. Then I'll tell you a story. When my daughter was 5, this psychologist was running experiments at the local science museum, and my daughter participated in one of these experiments. And the question was, well, okay, Matilda, you have 20 stickers, and you only need to use 10 of them, so you have 10 left over. And you have these 2 friends, Amelia and Susan, and they both want some stickers. They don't have any stickers. Amelia says she'll give you 50 cents for every one of the stickers you give her. But Susan says, I don't have any money. I can't give you any money. How do you allocate them? Matilda says, I give them each 5. And then the researcher says, does it matter to you at all that Amelia's willing to pay? Matilda says, 50 cents? I'm not sacrificing fairness for that price. Maybe $2. So not only did she have an innate sense of what fairness is, but she actually understood, like, there comes a price where, sorry, fairness. So I think we want to think about how people view these efficiency and fairness norms. So when it comes to teaching labor market discrimination, I think that it's really important that we start by acknowledging that discrimination is real, because that's where your students are coming from. And rather than questioning whether there is discrimination, let's start with a prior that there is discrimination, because people have felt it, right? And it is a squabble to get into a discussion. And I also find that this happens with economists a lot. We argue over the extent of problems, the precise point estimate, how big or small is this problem? And the rest of the world thinks we're arguing about whether something is or isn't a problem, right? And I will give you an example that always cracks me up, which is in a literature I've worked on and a paper Justin's written, which is, in the United States, we pass something called unilateral divorce, no-fault divorce. And during this period, when we enacted these no-fault divorce laws, the divorce rate soared. Economists have been squabbling about the impact of unilateral divorce laws on divorce in the pages of the AER over many decades. And their squabble is, was it a 0 effect or a very, very, very tiny effect? And the rest of the world is like, what? Like, we see this big increase in divorce. They think unilateral divorce must have driven most of it. Economists actually believe that unilateral divorce did not drive most of it, but we've actually failed to get that message out because we just keep squabbling over, what was the exact magnitude of the small effect. And so it's that, realize people come from a different place, and so they want to hear discrimination is real before they hear about measuring it. So that's one of the changes we made in our approach because of feedback we've gotten from students. So I used to, because I'm an empirical economist, I would teach all the sort of papers trying to measure discrimination. But every measurement has a caveat here and a caveat there, right? Because, well, we didn't, can we control for this or can we control for that? There's always caveats. And one of my students said to me at one point, it sounds like a lot of excuse making. It sounds like you're hedging. It sounds like, it just sounded very defensive to him. He said, this sounds defensive. You know, the models, those at least just give me a way to think about it. And you're not taking a position on whether there is or isn't. You're just explaining how this is how one type of discrimination could occur. This is how another type of discrimination could occur. And so he said, why don't you start with models so at least we're understanding how economists think discrimination enters the world. And so we've done that. We've switched I've switched how I teach it. We're switching how it's showing up in the textbook. And I think there's they need to hear all of our models for how discrimination is real are important. And I think, and again, I'm saying this as an empirical economist, I think that they do a better job of helping us understand the world we live in than any sort of empirical evidence that we currently have, because our evidence is weak and our models can offer some potential enlightenment. Now, let's point there. One of the things that I think really shaped how I think about this was a memo that Bill Spriggs wrote on Is Now a Teachable Moment for Economics. And in this memo, he wrote, an overwhelming majority of explorations of racial disparities in economic outcomes remains deeply tied to the view that race as an exogenous variable. And in the hands of far too many economists, it remains with the assumption that African Americans are inferior until proven otherwise. And in this regard, it places economists alone outside the mainstream of all other American social scientists. This is a really powerful and important piece. If you've never read the entire piece that Bill Spriggs wrote, I really highly suggest that you read it, because if you read these words and you think about it, these, and think about things like France decided that they were not going to measure race. Now, I think that that's problematic in and of itself because it allows you to hide problems that different groups are having. But at the same time, throwing in, a variable into our equations that's gender or race and just sort of allowing that to be this, exogenous factor, I don't know what that is, it's very othering. And that's a very hard thing. If you're an 18, 19-year-old sitting in your principles of economics class, this thing doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think it's important that we think about that, and we think about what's the null hypothesis that's being tested whenever you talk about empirical work. Students don't want you to, students start with a null hypothesis that there's discrimination around the world. They want the proof to be going the other direction. They want you to be saying, okay, you could show me that it isn't happening, but until you do, I'm going to believe that it is. And too often economists look to reject the null that there's no discrimination, and then their measurement doesn't allow them to reject the null. So I think that these are pretty subtle changes. They're really important changes to how we teach and approach students so that we're teaching a more inclusive classroom. And then when it comes to labor markets, we want to make sure we're understanding that the labor market itself is much more diverse than it has been in the past, and it's getting more diverse by the day. Every day, our population is shifting, our classrooms are shifting, and diversity is increasing. The last thing I want to say on teaching is it took me a long time to figure out how to teach systemic racism as an economist, because economists are so deeply rooted in individual behavior, right? And sociologists are much more rooted in the idea of, institutions shape what we do. But I think it's incredibly important that we teach systemic racism. We thought a lot about how do we include that in our textbook material. For me personally, I realized that I'm so deeply an economist. I'm so deeply at the individual behavior is that what I've had to do is realize that a lot of systemic racism just comes from individual behavior in the past that gets baked into the system and lasts. So, let's think about redlining has shaped our housing market today. And now it's like its own force. But where did that come from? That came from the incentives of people in the past. How did we end up with an unemployment insurance system today is still very, very racist in the sense of who's eligible, who gets benefits, and who doesn't. That came out of explicitly racist decision-making by politicians when they first passed the unemployment insurance system. And our students are much more, embracing these kinds of things. And I think it's really important that we're moving with them to include them, even in something like a principles of economics class where I'm just introducing economics, but you need to introduce, when you're teaching labor markets, a world that's the world that they see. So to put this together, our classrooms are more diverse. Inclusivity is the key to expanding economics and reaching more students. People learn by connecting materials to their real lives and validating their truths. And I think the one thing I would say, and I say this with my own personal identity, as now that I'm getting somewhat older, explore and learn with your students, because I've been learning a lot from my students. And if you've got to be, when you stand up and you are the teacher, you also want to be open to being the student and recognize the limits of our evidence.